Alrighty, so this is the federal, the parking program provider oriented discussion. This is oriented to providers, but that's all. It's the thinking I put into it. And it's about federal policies and their intersections with local programs. And I'm Bill Sweeney, as I'm reminded by Graham. I use the pronouns he and him. And I'm an old white guy with a big white beard, and I'm wearing a black hoodie. And Graham may or may not join us today. He has many irons in the fire. But first, as a matter of framing, I've been looking at the federal government for years, sometimes as allies, sometimes as a source of funding, sometimes as an opponent. But it's interesting that I have learned that all cabinet departments except the Department of State have something to do with homelessness. They either have policies that affect homelessness, or they fund programs that relate to homelessness, or the unhoused, or to vehicles, or to a whole bunch of other topics that are relevant. So if we narrow our sights and we think about HUD and founding and funding, I don't know that we will have we will not be able, I think, to use those very expensive services to the max. So whatever you may think about, there will probably always be some form of federal government programming that relates to the topic you have on your mind. And so that's in many cases a political nightmare. It is also in many cases a source of resources that is just unparalleled if you can learn how to tap it. So the resources may include funding, but there's also services that one can access, for example, Social Security. Food stamps, SNAP. There's access to land, especially in the Department of the Interior. There's access to housing through HUD, but also in other areas through the health, education, and welfare systems. There's access to food through the Department of Agriculture and through other systems. So there's a variety of resources as examples. So we come to housing first, and one of the interesting issues is whether it represents a barrier or a benefit. It's not clear. Sheltering, as we know it today, grew up over the last 40 or 50 years and was originally addressing very different populations, much smaller populations, who presented with a very different cross-section of needs. And today, the sheltering system has gone through 2 or 3 revolutions. The most recent was the switch to housing first thinking, and that has been both beneficial and not. It has been beneficial in that it somewhat places more emphasis on the more vulnerable persons needing help or service in the system. That can or cannot be a barrier, but that is exactly what it has done. And it can also, interestingly enough, be a huge barrier for a variety of reasons, and we'll talk about those and how to deal with them. Housing and urban development and its programming and its funding, which is mostly related to the shelter system, is where Housing First lives in governmental policy. For example, the Department of Education runs the McKinney-Vento program, which relates to a huge amount of work for unhoused people in the U.S. education system, youth and their families. And they are not particularly interested in housing first. They are interested in a very different set of care. There is a common definition of who their catchment is, who they want to serve, but each of them has adopted very, very different working regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations based on that legislation. And as a result, they have very different impacts. Is SS, so Amanda, you're asking, is SSI and SSDI actually accessible? Like all other programs that I'm aware of, it's technically accessible, but it has huge barriers. Um, I'm not aware of a barrier-free program. And engagement means learning to navigate the barriers. The barriers do include underfunding. There simply isn't enough to go around. Doesn't mean there couldn't be. It means that there currently isn't. And there's all kinds of other things. There are a whole lot of strategies in the development and the adoption of litigation that are adopted by people who don't want to see a program go in. So they will say, oh, okay, you're going to put in that program to help people I don't want to help. All right, well, I will say, let's amend your program to have some very, very specific rules about who can get in and how we can identify them and how we can keep careful records in order to make sure that the wrong people aren't helped. And all of a sudden, we create and put in place programs that are designed with barriers. It's part of our political system. There are virtually no examples to the contrary. And so we need to really think about the fact that that's always going to be there. It's always going to be hard to work with. And if we don't work with it, if we don't learn to navigate it, we just won't be able to attack those sources. So interestingly enough, Housing First was piloted about, started in about 2006 or so, and it became successful after the economic collapse of 2008. It was that program was piloted in Salt Lake City, and that the programming was headed by a guy named Lloyd Pendleton, who was a really nice guy and did a lot of good work. Roughly speaking, in 2008, 9, and 10, the programs he led housed about 3,500 unhoused people in Utah, pretty near as much as they could identify all the people in Utah who were unhoused and wanted to be housed. And it worked really well. And if you go and look at the statistics today, you will see that Salt Lake City has about the same proportion of unhoused people as anywhere else. So it was not a permanent solution. It was a solution at the time, which was one thing that was learned. There was a second thing that wasn't learned in that case, but that was learned a little later. So the next big success for Housing First was in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So in the 3 years after Hurricane Katrina, a significant number of unhoused people, nearly all the unhoused people who wished to be housed, became housed. And that was because Katrina had unhoused lots of people and left lots of housing damaged and vacant. And as the housing was brought back into usability, it was very low cost to acquire it, and that was what was done. And again, people were housed quickly, and for that particular period, there was a high level of housing and a low level of lack of housing in New Orleans. That's no longer the case. They are still trying to maintain a lower level of lack of housing than others, but they are not entirely successful. So the big issue was cheap housing. There isn't enough housing in the United States generally. And so while Housing First is said to be the correct program, there simply isn't enough to go around. Now I see Nakia has brought us a comment. She says, our McKinney-Vento experience was a 4-pack of underwear and a backpack from one of the largest school districts in Texas. No oversight or feedback. And yes, school district by school district is how these roll out. The McKinney-Vento programs at the federal level are very generous. School districts can choose how they operate. My daughter is on the school board for a large school district near where I live. And they are a very generous school district, and they do a good job. The next neighboring one, which includes Denver, is also a very generous jurisdiction. A suburban jurisdiction that's east of where I live and north of Denver is it's a very difficult jurisdiction, and their McKinney-Vento does not offer the same level of use of federal benefits. They have made a choice literally not to take available benefits, which would not be costly to them, would not cost them, and distribute them to people who need them. There are some interesting things about McKinney-Vento, by the way. The law says that if someone is living in an automobile and moves from place to place, it is the requirement of the school district to find them in the morning and get them to their regular school and take them home in the evening. That's to be done at no cost to the student. Not everybody figures out how to politically enforce that with their local school district, but it's there, and it supports families who are living in their cars. So we go from there, from the cheap housing being the issue with housing first, and we look at the United States where there isn't a sufficient stock of housing, period. Some people say as many as 5 or 10 million units of housing need to be added to our housing stock nationally. Whatever that number may be, it is a substantial number. And we don't have those houses, and therefore we just don't have a way within our political and economic system to guarantee housing for people who want it. It's simply not available. And so that brings us to another program called Built for Zero. It's a privately designed program. Community Solutions is a national scale consultancy that has designed it. It has been relatively successful at housing veterans over the last 5 years. The number of veterans who are unhoused, who would prefer to be housed, are very low now. And this has worked fairly well. It has worked fairly well because the community of veterans is highly politically successful and highly, or rather not highly, and very small, relatively speaking. And so the housing availability issue has not been crippling for Built for Zero. And so the Community Solutions folks say, look, we housed all the veterans, we could house everyone. Yes, we could, but we don't have houses existing. As a result, in most jurisdictions that have adopted housing first, they've also adopted something called coordinated entry to cut down on the number of people and prioritize the vulnerable for housing. And while this is a good idea, it means that the practical effect of housing first programming is that most people who are not extremely vulnerable will not be prioritized for housing. It's just not going to happen. You'll be put onto a waiting list that in one jurisdiction might be a 3-year or 5-year waiting list, and in another jurisdiction 10 years. Those numbers don't have any particular reality meaning. So we don't see housing first as being a successful way of going forward. Now, why am I spending time on all of this today? And Lisa B., you have a concern. How do we protect ourselves against the government trying to change property tax on alternative, charge property tax on alternative housing? There will always be taxes. The best you can do is work the advocacy chains to make sure that the taxing is fairly administered. There will always be taxes. There's simply nothing else we can do about that. There are taxes and license fees and other things. So think in terms of advocacy. If the tax is not being fairly levied, you have strong arguments for working on reducing the tax. And Nakia, again, thank you. Any past efforts to use FEMA trailers after individuals or families or households no longer using the trailers instead of auctioning the trailers off? Actually, I've tried to discuss that with FEMA, and we have not yet concluded our discussions here locally. They have told me that they regard it as a regional issue, or even a local issue in terms of having essentially excess inventory. They don't have, their standards don't allow them in many cases to be able to reuse a trailer once it's been used. And so, yes, they do auction them off. And could there be other ways of moving those trailers? Yes, there probably could be. And I think it's, again, a matter of spending time advocating with FEMA to see what can be done. So question is Housing First going to be compatible with vehicle residence programs? And the fundamental answer is, in most jurisdictions, it's not going to be helpful. And it's going to be harmful. So let me unpack both of those. The reason it won't be helpful is because it will not reach to a parking or a vehicle residence program participant who has, from the point of view of accessing the system, a fairly non-vulnerable way of life. It is probably a better way of life for many people to be vehicle resident than to be in the shelter system without any assets. However, if you do have the asset of a vehicle, and you are likely to have some employment in order, if for no other reason than to keep your vehicle fed and running, then it is quite likely that you will not qualify for the very, very vulnerable tests that would admit one to Housing First. So it's not going to be particularly helpful. It will also be harmful because, and I will get you in a second, Dawn, it will also be harmful because we see very, very limited abilities to get funding from HUD, which is the primary source of funding for people who are unhoused and seeking services on account of their unhoused status, because they are not perceived as being willing to cooperate with the system. Literally, if you maintain a vehicle residence, you are seen as being out of the shelter and not cooperative with the shelter. This is a significant problem, and we have been discussing it for the past 2 years with regional and national, on occasion, HUD folks. And so far, I have done very little other than to establish the realities of the conversation. So I'm going to switch over here. And Dawn, how do we advocate with FEMA? Every county has, part of its structure has a connection with FEMA. So start there in your county government. That's a good way to start. Every state has a FEMA office in the capital city. Start there. And that's a good way to start. Just start the conversation. You need to be persistent. And you will probably, the first few times you contact people, you will probably hear, I've got no idea, and there's nobody here who has an idea, and nobody's paid to pay attention to that. You need to work through those issues. Joel Kennedy. BFZ, Build for Zero, only focuses on chronic homelessness. Yes, that's correct. And requires a specific configuration of continuum of care in order to work. Yes, you are correct. It is not compatible with Washington or any state that uses balance of state COC model. Yes, partially correct. I have seen the balance of state in Colorado, for example, is fairly successful with Built for Zero for veterans, for the reason that veterans are successful. And I agree with you that I don't think it can be expanded beyond veterans. Not compatible with people who choose to live in their vehicles. Yes, you are absolutely right, Joel. There is no question that Housing First, no matter how it's designed, whether it's in Build for Zero format or in Housing First format, Housing First is not compatible with people who choose to live in their vehicles. And the pouring of essentially the devoting of essentially 100% of funding to Housing First channels is very specifically not a funding of vehicle residency programs. And this is one of the problems we've had and have been talking about. Nakia, taxing a homestead, registration fees wouldn't, additional fees. I'm sorry, Nakia, could you unmute? There's enough typing errors here that I can't make quick sense of it. Could you unmute and just speak out, please? Nakia?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, yeah. Apologies. I'm actually en route somewhere. So, yeah, it was just a person's question posed earlier about possible, like if we're moving towards like a homestead or some type of taxes for vehicle residents. So my question would be, I guess, as advocates for vehicle residents, wouldn't our arguments be related to double taxation because we're already paying registration fees and other fees? And then my second point was then also as a benefit, like homeowners get the benefit, you know, the government pushing out the solar panels and other homestead exemptions and tax write-offs. So I was saying that would that be feasible as a counter instead of it just being this kind of punitive system where we're getting additional taxes, but instead we're getting some of the benefits when home is defined as a vehicle.
Sure. One of my sons, for example, has a van that he uses from time to time. He goes for months at a time and lives in it. And it has solar panels on the roof. Obviously, those don't work like the solar panels on the roof of houses I see in neighborhoods from a taxing perspective. But you have a really great question, shouldn't it? And I don't know that the answer is well thought out. There is probably a lot of room for advocacy in that area, for going to the correct agencies and starting to work on those issues. I think that's in the housing part of housing and urban development, not the urban development part. And you might find a lot of interesting stuff there. It may also be Department of Energy. So both of those departments are places to start and just ask that question. How could we get tax credits for solar panels on our dwelling vehicles? I think that'd be a great question to start working. Amanda, would a vehicle be considered a housing choice component? No, because it is defined right now in the Code of Federal Regulations as a place not fit for human habitation. So you cannot get a housing choice voucher for a vehicle any more than you can get it to live in an active pigsty. It's just not going to work. We are working on the issue of changing the Code of Federal Regulations. Yesterday, we had a lobbyist named John Threlkeld speaking, and you can look up his materials, but he was basically talking about an effort to change that definition to allow funding, certain funding streams in HUD to flow to people who are vehicle resident. I'm not sure whether that'll happen or not, but there's something going on. I can see a hand for Bill Kieran. Bill, do you want to speak up?
Sure, thanks. I've appreciated this, and one of the things that I'm not sure has really come up is one of the options that we've looked at besides safe zones on streets for people living in vehicles is for those in an RV that's worth staying in for several years, to begin to provide them something that we would call a local voucher to stay in something like a mobile home park. They don't really exist in plentiful nature by the urban population, but there are some around, and it would be an entrepreneurial effort it would have to start. But I would guess that there would be no public, meaning federal funding attaching to that. And if we did vouchers that would help someone with 30% or anything like that, it would have to all be local. Have you heard of any programs similar to that?
I haven't heard of any program similar to that. I'm familiar with the political issues. In the county where I live, we used to have 40, 50 years ago, we had well over a dozen trailer parks, to use a poor term, but that's effectively. We were down to 2, but now one of the city councils has bountifully decided to buy it up and make it a Habitat for Humanity build area as a special gift. And so we are down to just 1 now. And that's the local politics. That's an issue for advocacy and local political work.
Yeah, I think we just look at it not as a 5 or 10-year solution, but as another stage of stability, as more housing can become available. That's how we try to describe this. It's an old HUD line, pathway to stability. And you and others know well that there are many stages on your pathway to stability. And sometimes you stick in one for 5 years and you've been doing pretty well. So we'll keep people posted through this whole organization if we make any progress.
Well, that sounds good. I've talked to one housing manufacturer that has a factory just north of here, and their experience with Department of Transportation, which decides what constitutes a manufactured house and what constitutes a trailer and so forth, has been that the lines are very blurry. And if you can get yourself into the column called manufactured housing, even though you may have something on wheels that has to be lifted off and landed, you may very well be able to take advantage of funding streams that are not in place for things that are called house trailers or something of that nature.
Well, the tiny homes on wheels is already populating much of the country.
Exactly.
And when they're on wheels, they get through the permitting.
They sure do. So Betsy, I see you have a question. Would you like to speak up? And
well, the issue of alternatives, of new housing and getting housing included, getting alternative homes, portable homes onto the HUD register, I think has shifted because the International Building Code has now allows for it. So, but local, anyway, my question was more about, I spend a lot of time in the tiny home space, but my question is, I see Amanda, I think it was, said, oh, your housing choice vouchers, which I'm assuming is how Housing First works. I just don't have that. And she said that transfers to Section 8. So in our area, it does not transfer to Section 8 because those wait lists are huge and closed. So I wanted to know a little bit more about the mechanism for these coordinated entry groups to actually find decent housing near your community, because the experience I've seen is people are sent out a place that's like 2 hours by public transit to get back to your doctor, or your friends.
So those can be
really
difficult.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of different levels, and it depends upon what the housing target is. So there's something that's called permanent supportive housing, or PSH.
Yeah.
And that, often is and mostly is publicly owned. And it is for kids. If that's where it is, that's where one would be sent. And it is pretty much reserved for the most vulnerable segment of the population.
Yeah. So if you're not a drug addict, those people I'm meeting feel a little aggrieved. They're not RVs.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
So
then
the
different tranches. But
the next step is the housing voucher and the affordable housing route. And that is very difficult because it is essentially a transfer of funding to property owners through the hands of the unhoused.
Yep.
As a result, there's not much control over the property owner portion of the transfer. So it can be, well, I've seen it in this jurisdiction. Up until about 5 years ago, more than half of the vouchers that we were able to get for the community were returned unused when they expired at the 90-day mark because they couldn't be leased up. We now are getting close to 100% lease up because we've created programs to literally take people by the hand and walk them through leasing once they get their,
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Good, thank you. That's, I mean, good for you.
Yeah.
That's what's needed.
So, yeah, we need those kinds of things, but we have to realize that these systems have been created in ways that are reminiscent of other kinds of public spending. The spending that the U.S. government spends on foreign aid, for example, I pointed out that State Department is not really a source of funding for the unhoused or the vehicle resident in the United States. They are for those in other countries, among other things. About, depending upon whose statistics you read, 80 to 90% of that money is spent in the United States and not overseas. So one of the ways that the program is made popular is not by sending money to a destination, but by buying American goods and hiring American consultants and sending them on American carriers. And so it's a very similar money routing issue. And it dislocates a lot of the work that was intended by the program. It's part of politics, part of what Tristia calls making the sausage. Amanda, would you like to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to clear something up. Okay, when I talk about Section 8, I'm not talking about where you're on a wait list. Those are for incoming people. If you already have a voucher, you are under the Section 8 program. It may not be called Section 8. It may be called Shelter Place Care. It may have a specialized name,
Yeah.
but you are under that. So what'll happen is if you want to move out of the area of that specialized jurisdiction, they will just move you over to like the federal one. So you don't go on a waiting list because you're not an incumbent.
That's right. You have a personal voucher and you carry it with you.
Yeah, so that's very different than applying for Section 8 and being an incumbent and put on that wait list. What I'm talking about is if you are already holding a voucher, that voucher is under there and you'll translate over however that moves.
You're completely right, Amanda. You're absolutely
right. So I wanted to clear that up because I thought I may have not explained it well in my notes.
No, and I think you've done a good job. Thank you very much. James, you've just become visible. Do you wish to speak?
No, I'm just listening.
Oh, okay, great. Are there any other hands up that I'm not seeing? I think not.
Looks like Betsy Morris. Looks like she's
Betsy, there we go.
I'm sorry, I just spoke, but so if there's someone else, I'll pause. But otherwise, I do have something of another question.
Well, let's jump into it.
Well, I know, we all know the systems are just plain broken and they're designed, but I'm not firsthand. So my secondhand knowledge of people, when I send them, oh, go to 211, oh, that takes an hour on a phone voicemail hell, and you have to use the words, not coordinated entry, but intake. Like you have to know this secret code just to get to the coordinated entry people. And then I guess then the program becomes a mystery to me. It's great that you could transfer into a Section 8 national database of eligibility, but I was getting the impression that the Shelter Plus doesn't transfer right now, at least in Oakland, to another. You only get to use it once. The assumption is you're going to get into housing, and then I guess you'll be okay and won't need it if you don't get along with your landlord or whatever.
Yeah.
So
there are multiple programs and they have different, it's confusing because if you get into one, you're locked into one and not another. There's Rapid rehousing, for example, has the characteristics in their vouchers that you're speaking of. They can be as
Oh,
short as
that's
30 days or as long as
got it.
18 months, even 3 years in some
So
cases.
I'm just appalled at how, bureaucratic and paperwork is used to really just demoralize people. If your papers have been, I won't go into all the reasons. So my question is there anywhere where the unhoused constituents or consumers of this program have made it into the decision-making bodies? And I don't actually mean necessarily city council, but have a seat at the table when programs are designed locally, or there's people trained and then paid to be helper advocate guides. And I know there's lots of good volunteers who do that, even people who've been unhoused, but we're all like, how to get a seat at the table to bring to the attention of breakdowns to these service providers who, if they know about the breakdowns, they have not been able to solve problems and make the system easier. So that's my question.
So Betsy, there are a lot of places to go. The National Low Income Housing Coalition, NLHIC.
I'm a member. I'll look at their
There
website.
you go. Well, listen, work through your membership to get in touch with the lobbyists. They will love to hear from you, and they will talk with you, and they will listen to your ideas, and they will probably ask you to come and give testimony.
I give a lot of, thank you.
John
And hopefully it'll
Threlkeld,
change something.
yeah, John Threlkeld, who was on the program yesterday, is a professional lobbyist for one of these agencies, and that was why he was here. He wanted to essentially become knowledgeable in vehicle residency so he could begin to lobby on our behalf. And that's the whole thing. So one of the great places to go are the national coalitions. There are half dozen of them or so.
Yeah.
Who do support lobbyists and lobbying activity.
So I'll just say that's wonderful. And yes, I don't have lived experience of homelessness. So I'm a Gray Panthers leader here in our Bay Area, and we know this is, and I'll just say one other thing where I am active and we're looking is that nationally, the National Alliance of HUD Tenants is the largest tenants union in the country, and they are full of all the things that they know what's not working in that system. And because HUD needs the landlords who are causing pain and suffering to their tenants, HUD can't really do anything, because then they'll just go out of the business. Oh, I'll just start serving students. I mean, yes, some of them have contracts. So we're up against a really bad situation, as everyone knows. You mentioned that most of these solutions just put more money in the hands of the same property owners. Well, maybe not the same, but into the hands of landlords and property owners who are not using it to benefit the rest of the world.
And under our system of politics, that's how things are currently sold. And to make a change, we have to be involved in politics, and we have to do
organize. Thank you so much.
Organize. There's no other question. Amanda, thank you very much for your guidance on connecting with the HUD Exchange. For those of you who are not familiar with the HUD Exchange, if you look in the chat, you will see Amanda's connection there. And that is a terrific source of information on how programs work. It's not in and of itself a channel for lobbying with the HUD Exchange. There is a national HUD question answering function, which is your entry point for dealing with HUD at the national level, although they tend to push you down to the regional level. And so you can just start by talking to your HUD regional people if you want to lobby. Reggie, I see you have a comment in the chat. Would you like to come in and speak, and then we'll go to Dawn?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not experiencing vehicle homelessness. I'm an advocate in a group called Santa Cruz Cares. And we tried to, well, we successfully blocked the enforcement of a parking ban in Santa Cruz in the Coastal Commission area, which is where they wanted to enforce it most, by appealing to the Coastal Commission. But I think I just wanted to sort of validate a little bit of sort of the feeling that like legislatures are not like great places to bring energy, because we spend a lot of energy ahead of going to the Coastal Commission, trying to appeal to city council, trying to appeal to all kinds of local decision makers. And they were just 100% ignoring, the folks that we brought in to speak about their experiences, the sort of science behind, what it means to be in this position and like what policies actually make sense. And it's just a frustrating position to be in. And it's even more frustrating to know that at the state level, Gavin Newsom recently vetoed the wiping away of parking tickets going to people who are living in vehicles who don't have the money to pay them. That was just absolutely devastating. And to see the parking commission or committee or whatever it is, the administration at the state level say that, well, we need that money somehow. I mean, it's like, I think it would help to sort of just validate that like the situation we're in is so sociopathic. And it requires a huge amount of like effort to build the strength and the power and the compassion to push back. And we're trying to do that. But I feel like it's important to just kind of sit in it for a minute to just kind of understand like how rough the situation is, especially in Santa Cruz, where there's a history of just extreme anti-houseless behavior, maybe worse than other places, where even in the 80s, people beat up homeless people for sport, and worked with the police to do it. So, yeah.
It is a tough world. Reggie, thank you very much. Dawn, you may be the last if you would like to speak. And I'm expecting that any second now we will have someone break in and cut us off and send us back. But as long as we're here, let's keep going.
Can you guys hear me?
We sure can.
Okay, so I kind of wanted to just respond to Betsy's question about, have there been any opportunities for people to sit at the table? And pulling from my own experience, having spent a number of years living outside and in my vehicle, and then working in this field now for the past, 4 years. I recently took a position with the Regional Housing Authority here in Seattle and ended up leaving because even though it looked like I had a seat at the table, it was more like this token. I really didn't have the ability to affect any kind of change at that level. And so left and went back to the nonprofit where I was able and allowed to speak up without, fostering a hostile work environment. But at the same time, there have been opportunities like the task force that was, put together as a result of the Blake decision here in Washington. And I think I emailed probably 25 people trying to figure out a way to get on that task force and still was not able to accomplish that. And I have a pretty extensive network of folks that work in advocacy in this particular subject. So I feel like I know the answer is no, we don't have enough people with a seat at the table whose voices are actually being heard in a meaningful way that have this lived experience. And I think putting that the onus or even asking that of people who are in that survival space on the streets is asking too much, because showing up for something is just not a priority when you're trying to make sure that you're safe overnight or you don't freeze to death from the cold. So I guess I just wanted to put that out there and answer no, I have not seen a seat at the table, even in what is supposed to be a highly progressive state in Washington, in Seattle specifically.
So Dawn, you are absolutely right that survival comes first and it dominates all else. And there's no question that is one of the difficult things. But we do have allies, and I think that they can be extremely helpful. And even if we cannot get an ally appointed to a commission, it's very, very difficult to have a public meeting that is not public. And so allies can go to those meetings and become effective simply by being present over and over again. Many of you may know of an organization called the League of Women Voters. It's one of the most effective at doing this. They attend virtually all the meetings they can think of on behalf of the public and create an alternative public record for themselves and for their own purposes. They often are not seated, but they are very effective because they are always present. And so simply being present in the room may not be a seat at the table, but it is a solid start to advocacy. I am getting messages that we are going to be cut off virtually momentarily. So I want to thank you all. This has been a great conversation and I've learned a lot. So thank you.